In this video, I'm going to talk about writing a research question and then coming up with a title for my research project. So I'm interested in the Titanic, and from this thing of I'm interested in this vague thing to an observation can sometimes take a little bit of work. So what is it that I'm going to observe about the Titanic? If I put out my research question in the PICO format, so population, intervention, comparison, and outcome, there's a few things that I already know just because of what I'm interested in. So I'm interested in, passengers on the Titanic. And I'll probably come back and clarify this in a second when we see just a little bit of stuff on the web page. An intervention only happens when we have an experiment, so it's not applicable here. The comparison, I'm not sure what my comparison is going to be yet because I haven't really worked out what it is exactly that I'm interested in. The outcome is probably fairly straightforward in this case. It's not always in every situation. Sometimes it's quite difficult to work out what is it that I'm actually measuring as my main outcome. And sometimes you can have several outcomes of interest, which then can make the analysis longer. In this case, we've got one outcome of interest, which is hopefully obvious to anyone who's familiar with the story of the Titanic, and that's survival. So in this case, I already know what my outcome is, and from a statistical point of view, I know what this type of variable is as well, and this will be important later, and I know that this is a binary outcome of either they survived or they died. So I'm just going to put that in there because that's helpful. Now, if you have several outcomes of interest, and we might talk about what to do in that situation in a separate video, it's probably helpful to write out what is the type of each possible outcome variable as you go, just to keep that in mind for future reference. Now, what am I interested in? Surely I've got some comparison I want to make, but what is it? So if I look through, and this is where we come back to the introduction, what is already known and where is the gap? So this is where I have to decide what I already know and what is the gap. And this can be a tiny bit artificial for a student project because often it feels like everything is already known about the topic you're looking for, but you can still find your little niche, your little spot that you're going to do something new, I think, in there. So we already know that the Titanic was a big ship and it sank and lots of people died. All these videos are unavailable. Oh, that one is. So what I'm going to do is have a look at some of these titles here. And obviously, if this was a real project, maybe you'd look a bit more in depth into it. So we've got a story here about a crewman on the Titanic. And part of the reason I put passengers here is because I know that the data set I have is only of the passengers, not the crewmen. So I might make a note actually now that I've got a limitation to my study, even though I haven't included it as the entire population. Whatever I do is only relevant to the passengers. And so even if it's not specifically part of my research question, it may be considered a limitation that I haven't considered the crewmen or crew women. I don't even know if I assume women must have worked on the Titanic. Even though it was quite a long time ago, they would have had maids and there would have been positions that were filled by women. Haven't considered crewmen, crew men, women, crew people. And I'll just keep that in mind for later. If I was writing this for real, I might actually put that down in the discussion section right now. Women and children first. And this is something that I think everyone's quite familiar with, is that we know we're going to need to adjust for the fact that women and children probably had higher survival chances, rates. I'll just put a question mark there now. So I know that I'm going to need to consider that, and I'm just going to say adjust. You might have a list of confounding variables. I could also just consider these to be demographic variables. And then the other little thing that I'm going to notice here is that we do have this class system. So if I already knew that women and children probably had higher survival chances, then perhaps the gap in the literature here is I know that we've got first, second, and third class passengers. Is there a difference in survival between these different classes? So perhaps my main comparison here is passenger class. There's probably going to be more variables in the data set besides passenger class, and we can add them in as secondary comparisons or controlling variables or confounding variables. Sometimes it's helpful just to list all the variables you have in your data set and go through as to whether they are sort of relevant and interesting and important, and if you need to adjust for them in your analysis. So I'm probably ready to write a first draft of my research question, and that might be something along the lines of, is there a difference in survival between the 3 passenger classes on the Titanic after adjusting for sex and age? Now, maybe I will need to revise this and make this, refine it, make this better in some way. But as a first draft, that's completely fine. And I've got an idea of what it is that I'm going to look at. The research question doesn't have to be a question. It could be a statement. So it could be, the aim of this project is to investigate if blah, 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 there is a difference in the other thing. So your research question can be written as a statement. So the last thing I'm going to do in this video is think about how I turn this into a title. If we go to the BMJ homepage, you can see some examples of titles. And I will just point out a couple of things. I wonder if I can get rid of that ad, about each title. So the main thing that stands out to me is that every title includes what kind of study it is. Systematic review, population-based study, primary care data, a mixed method study, that's very vague, cross-sectional study, the dreaming study. What's this? Oh, it's a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial. So that's a full-on study. Observational study. So there's something in the title which indicates what type of study it is. And then there has to be something about what are you looking at. So it might just be the outcome, gender diversity in the so when I say population, I'm referring to the PICO. So we've got the outcome and the population. Outcome, adverse childhood experiences. So this is a whole lot of descriptive stuff. I can't see a comparison in here. Let's look at the RCT. So you'll notice that the RCT, because it's an experiment, they have used the word effectiveness, whereas the cross-sectional study just said associations. So rather than a comparison between, they've got a comparison with. So adverse childhood experiences and attitude towards COVID-19 restrictions. So an association or a correlational study isn't necessarily a distinct comparison between 3 groups like we have with the passenger class, but then you would still consider this the comparison in here. So if the main outcome of interest was the most recent thing, which would be the attitudes towards COVID-19 restrictions, and then the comparison would be presumably with or between adverse childhood experiences. I don't know how that's measured, so that would change how you use that word. They've said between, so maybe they are putting people into groups, but that's how you could break that up. Effectiveness of, so here's the intervention, low dose, I can't say that, amitriptyline, and something else for insomnia. So the insomnia must be the outcome. This is the intervention. The intervention will then also be the comparison, and they'll presumably have a range of other variables that they're looking at. So you can see that the parts of the research question are also going into the title with the addition of the study type or where they're getting their data from. So what we would need to put into here is something along the lines of differences in survival between passenger classes. This might need some work. Class on the Titanic. Let's say a modern look at an historical data set. A modern look, a retrospective on... So it depends how flashy you want to be with your title. It could be that, or it could be, let's say, a retrospective, because we are looking back in time. So maybe I'll change that to be less punchy and more academic. A retrospective analysis of... now it's an historical data set because it actually was, as far as I know, collated by historians. It could just be an existing study from somewhere else. So you would need to look at how the data set was compiled to give that a name. So if you're if you've got secondary data and it's come from, say, a UK nationwide survey, then that's what you would put in here. It's just that this one I know happens to have been compiled by historians, so I'm going to call it an historical data set. So if you're struggling in writing your research question, your research statement, and your title for your study, what I recommend that you do is have a look at some papers in your area. So I've just looked on the front page of the BMJ. You could look at a different journal. You could do a search for something much closer to your study area. So I could have done a search. I'm thinking papers from people drowning from large ships is not going to be a big area of research, but I could have just searched survival and just had a look at how other people write. I could have searched retrospective and survival just to see how other papers write their title for something like that. Okay, so that's it for this video. I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do in the next one. I think we'll get started looking at the data.